The landscape is screaming at you, waiting for you to recognize its face and hear its names. Do you not have eyes to see the truth, ears to hear its spoken name? Albion calls you on the winds of time from a distant past, erased from his story, but to deny Albion's existence is to deny your future as a sovereign being that no government has the right to remove. The names in the landscape are a reminder that Albion is truth and knowledge. The more you deny its truth, the more it shouts them at you. For this landscape will not be silenced, censored, or oppressed any longer. Its truth will be heard by all that have ears to hear. It will be seen by all that have eyes to see, spoken by all that have a mouth to tell its truth. Welcome to my 5th video in this series, in which I will be trying to bring together the facts and evidence of the entire Albion Zodiac and drawing some interesting conclusions about the landscape, Graham K. Griffiths' Behold Jerusalem, the Glastonbury Zodiac, as well as setting course for my next voyage of discovery. So, a little recap of the series so far. In video 1, I looked at the coastline of North Wales, showing Virgo and her remarkable resemblance to the Egyptian goddess Isis, including her severed head. In video 2, I showed the Lamb of God and how its orientation gave me the clue to date this design. I also mentioned there have been many religious leaders that have called themselves the Lamb of God. I think it exceeds 35, including the Egyptian god Osiris, who was the brother and husband of Queen Isis. In video 3, I introduced Cetus, the latest addition to the Albion Zodiac family. And in video 4, I looked at the intelligence of the design and how it was out of sequence with the constellations as they appear overhead. Graham K. Griffiths set himself the task of seeing if he could identify the 12 zodiacal figures of Catherine Maltwood's Glastonbury Zodiac within the landscape of England and Wales, but I feel his working brief restricted his research, and the content of his 2003 publication, Behold Jerusalem. Catherine Maltwood, Mary Kane and Graham Griffiths were all looking for the 12 symbols of the zodiac as defined by Ptolemy some 2,000 years ago. But Albion is far older. I think Graham was a little put out by his discovery of a Griffin and the fact that Scorpio appeared to have been tossed overboard from the Ark of Cancer, which again supports my reasoning that the Albion Zodiac was never meant to be astronomically positioned, but more as a repository of myths, legends, and fables associated with the constellations, heavens above, and the gods. The ancient Greeks believed that myths were factual, or at least based upon facts, which may or may not have been embellished over time in their retelling. The Albion Zodiac's graphical representations of the constellations can all be identified purely by their contribution to the coastline of the British Isles, and I feel Graham was forced to include the Griffin in Jerusalem, as without it he would have been left with an unexplained void or a black hole in Blackpool. He was also forced to include Northern Ireland's Scorpio, otherwise the whole 12 symbols of the zodiac argument would have been lost too. But he probably chose not to show Cetus, which I'm sure he saw, but showed as a swirly white cloud, just asking to be blown away by someone able to realize the value of the knowledge and see past the mist of preconceptions reinforced by an education system designed to stop inquisitive minds questioning its authority. The more highly educated you become within their system, the less able you are to question your education or the authority of those who control it. State education is then the source of your induction into their tyrannical system and your enslavement under its control. As with the Glastonbury zodiac, the albion's graphical representations of the constellations do not match those of Ptolemy's, but we should not say ours or Ptolemy's are wrong, just different. After all, there is around 6,000 years and over 2,000 miles or 3,000 kilometers difference in their collation. Within this 6,000 years and difference in cultures and knowledge, it's not hard to assume there have been not only an alteration of the graphical representation, but also their names, especially if it was felt that old political, cultural, or religious references needed to be removed and new ones asserted. These alterations of the design and names could be viewed as a symbolic book burning or removal of knowledge. Once again, I find myself returning to the fact that the Albion zodiac is the largest body of evidence from the past that cannot be altered or destroyed. Within our taught knowledge of the past, we are told that the Druids were the learned class, acting as priests, teachers, healers, and even the justice system. Now that sounds like biblical Nephilim. And the Druids are generally depicted as taller than the general population they commanded. We are told that they had verbal traditions with rhymes and stories used to pass on knowledge, and they taught this knowledge to the Celts. It is also said that the writing of this knowledge was unlawful, but as it is only the Roman writing that tells us of the Druids, this just seems to be a cover story for the removal of past knowledge by saying it was never written whilst the writing was removed or destroyed. Likewise, the writing on the walls of Egypt and other past civilizations could not have been the first attempt at writing and must surely have been developed over time on other perishable materials. But with our 2020 vision, we might even have to call into question its authenticity, or at least any prehistory references made in it, and there must surely have been other records of their past in their libraries of knowledge. I'm reminded of the Rosetta Stone, and I always wondered if this was part of a larger tablet or group of tablets that might have included many other languages from further afield, or if it was a copy from a scroll of paper or animal hide. Ancient mariners, we are told, developed a phonetic alphabet to record foreign languages and carry these translations to assist their foreign trade. These were surely not carried on stone tablets. The destruction of knowledge and libraries throughout history is covered within my Starfort series within my Our Story playlist. The Romans, we are told, had a habit of destroying the history of the land they invaded and conquered and replacing it with their own version of events and imposing their religious beliefs system too. This would have initially been an integration of their history and religion into that of the indigenous population. Looking at biblical related text transcribed post-flood, we can find evidence that the Book of Enoch was adjusted to take into account the local traditions and belief. This evidence within the text, carried and distributed by Noah's sons, is then evidence that the biblical story of Genesis relating to Noah and the flood are not 100% factual, as it clearly states that all of humanity was destroyed by the flood. If this was the case, then no assimilation of the text would be required to assert its truth to an indigenous population, as there would have been no population or alternative views of religion. The Roman Catholic Church even redesigned the Christian faith to incorporate older Roman pagan rituals and beliefs before enforcing it worldwide. They then set up the Islamic faith to bring down the remaining Christians that would not accept the Roman Catholic doctrine. And I'm sure I've said it before, but history is written by the victors, and we could make the assumption, based on two sides fighting, that 50% or one side of the story of history is lost after every battle. The victors stamp their authority by further removing written knowledge as they advance into new territories. It is said that the Druids incited the Celts to oppose the Roman invasion, but this is the written history of the victorious Romans written by the Romans, so any written knowledge prior to that about Albion seems to have been removed by them. And if I am correct in my thinking that the cover story about the Druids and the Celts' written knowledge being unlawful, we might assume that this was the Romans' law and their enforcement that removed any written history or knowledge of pre-Roman Albion. Indeed, it seems, according to our Romanized view of history, that prior to their expansion of their empire, the population of the rest of the world lived in an unenlightened existence prior to being educated by them. But more on the missing written knowledge of the Druids later. So let's now recap the Albion Zodiac. Our knowledge and history locked in the landscape of Albion. The constellation of Aries is to us the ram and separate from the fleur-de-lis, but in Albion it is seen as the Lamb of God holding up the crucified religious deity, whoever that is, and I'll come back to him before the end of the video. Remember, there have been at least 35 religious deities referring to themselves as the Lamb of God, all born on the 25th of December, all died for 3 days before being resurrected. Some are mentioned in video 2 of this series, along with an explanation of how this is simply pagan sun worship. The Albion landscape is literally littered with written and verbal clues of its existence and historic acknowledgement of its truth. The most recently found knowledge of Albion and this constellation of Aries, written or hidden in plain sight, are Withen, Withenwick, and Withensea. The withers is the section of an animal around the shoulder between the neck and the back. And as we can see, these withers are all placed on the landscape in the area of our lamb's own withers. Within the landscape of Albion, Sagittarius has the same face and arm as Ptolemy's Sagittarius, but without his bow, and in Albion we only see the head and the arm, as the rest is below water level of the depiction. His eye is at or near the Suffolk town of Eye, and I wonder if we should be looking for another Glastonbury-style zodiac around this area. Or maybe we might see something different reflected in this eye, and accept that the dove is reflected in the name of the river that flows through Eye. His outstretched hand waits for the returning dove of Libra to land at Dover. Is this giant our saviour, our ark builder? Chapter 2 of the Albion Landscape Zodiac series has more references for you to discover. Thinking back to the Roman account of the invasion, is this our Druid, leading Albion into rebuffing yet another European invasion? And am I now reminded that history repeats itself? Or is it the story writers regurgitating old ideas and stories? Do our giants become Goliath to Rome's David? Or maybe like a reality simulation film or the myth of Sisyphus, we are destined to repeat the same task over and over again until we can break the cycle and remember our true history. Capricorn was a goat to Ptolemy, or goatfish, but here we have our unicorn fish or single-horned goatfish. Do we literally have Lancelot, our mare with her lance? She stretches from Canterbury in the east to western super mare. In the Celtic origin story, although it's technically a post-creation part, a mare, Eiocha, was born from the white sea foam where the sea met the land. In my last video, I showed how our unicorn fish forms the white wake of the ark. Is this the sea foam taking sea form? And should we now call Capricorn by her Celtic name of Eiocha? In the Celtic creation story, and I'm sticking with the Celtic version, although in other cultures we may find striking similarities, but as I believe the Celts are most associated with Albion, this seems the most appropriate. It goes on to tell us of a strong and sturdy oak, although this has been given the name of the Tree of Life. But I'm going to throw in some thoughts here, as we do indeed find a strong and sturdy oak, but in the form of the Ark of Cancer. Now we know Cancer as a crab, but in Albion and Glastonbury it is an ark. Within the Albion zodiac, its form is invisible, but like the wind, it is not seen directly, but its presence is felt and seen as it corrals the land-based animals of the design into its hold. Now, for the sake of King Arthur and all his association with the magic of Merlin, who may also have been the Welsh bard Taliesin, I ask you to now imagine that the ark of our landscape is made from an invisible oak. This isn't as daft as it might first sound. Oak, as we have been taught, is hard-wearing and strong, so maybe referring to something that is strong and sturdy, we might liken it to oak. And now looking to Cancer, we see nothing but its effects on the landscape. Now look out of your window. Do you see the glass or just feel its effects? If you said yes to seeing the glass, might I recommend that you clean it and look again? But my point is that if we didn't know what glass was, then we might describe it as being strong and sturdy against the wind and rain, as strong as the oak, maybe. And with this, we can once again find our Arthurian reference as told by Taliesin in his poem, The Spoils of Annwn, where he tells of King Arthur sailing in the glass ship Prydwen to the underworld in search of the lost cauldron of inspiration belonging to Cerugin, the Earth Mother. And upon its discovery, man's lost wisdom would be recovered from the black hole of ignorance. More on that one later too. The Celtic creation story goes on to say that life was brought forth from the oak as the tree of life, but we might also say that life was brought forth from the ark as the floodwaters receded. And while we're splashing about in the waters, we have Pisces, and in our modern Ptolemy zodiac, it's defined as two fish, although we only see a single fish in Albion, and he is swimming in the wake of Capricorn and Cancer. In Celtic tales, we find the salmon of knowledge, where the fish gains the knowledge of the world after eating nuts and then falling into the well of wisdom, which has a ring of rabbit holes, being dark holes full of knowledge, and brings my thoughts to Alice in Wonderland, who, like Neo in The Matrix, followed the white rabbit to discover the reality of the world's deceptions. And how apt are these tales for our modern world. In modern zodiacal terms, Pisces is at the end of the sequence that starts with Aries before it repeats. So we might also say that Pisces has the knowledge and wisdom of all that has gone before. But is our Celtic well of wisdom that the salmon fell in the same as Cerugin's cauldron of inspiration that will take us out of the ignorance and restore our wisdom and knowledge? Graham also associates our fishy peninsula with Jonah, making Pisces the whale of this tale. And there are many associations connected with Cornwall and Devon to Arthurian circles, but many appear debatable. So who is in our strong and sturdy oak or ark of life? Heading north from Pisces, sniffing out the back of the ark, is Leo. We know him as a lion, but our big cat hasn't got the bushy mane that we might expect, and he might be a she. Maybe our lion is a lioness, is sniffing out the mythical land of Lioness that was alleged to have been off the coast of our fishy peninsula, or maybe there was confusion and Lioness is the head of our Lioness across the Bristol Channel. Our magical Welsh bard Taliesin seems to have been fully aware of our Albion landscape that has remained hidden in plain sight for millennia, and says,
"There is a noxious creature from the rampart of Santanas, which has overcome all between the deep and the shallow. Equally wide are his jaws as the mountains of the Alps. Him death will not subdue, nor hand or blades. There is a load of 900 wagons in the hair of his two paws. There is in his head an eye green as the limpid sheet of icicle. 3 springs arise in the nape of his neck, sea roughs thereon."
I'm not sure if there could have been a mistranslation in gender. Maybe someone could see if my suspicion is founded here. And maybe there is a discrepancies in Graham's original depiction, as he assigns the coastline from Carmarthen round to Llanelli to the tail end of Aries, rather than our lion's second front paw as seen on most depictions of rampant lions and within the Glastonbury zodiac too. On the Gower Peninsula, that everyone seems to recognise as the paw, is North Hill Tor, Is this the thorn in our lion's paw? Is our lion sniffing out a mouth in the back of the ark to help remove the thorn, as in Aesop's fable? Or will Androcles, or maybe Saint Jerome, help pull out the thorn? This seems to be an example where either history repeats itself, or lions seem to be prone to getting thorns in their paws. Maybe the stories have been rewritten to suit the audience. Or just maybe it's an example that known history is a lie and regurgitated to keep us from finding the truth. But all comes back to the landscape of Albion. And with that bombshell, we must really question our reality and even the writing on the walls of ancient civilizations. But for a moment, let's continue on with what we can see in our landscape. Virgo is known for being the maiden of the harvest, but as we have seen, she is just at home with sowing the seeds. Queen Isis is said to have taught the Egyptians how to sow seeds and sow material. And as a friend pointed out, everything to do with yeast. So brewing beer, baking bread, and the same with Anna. She is at home with our Lioness too. In the Holy Grail, we have the Queen of North Gallis or North Wales. And how apt is that name? For we have a queen in North Wales. And as the Earth Mother, we might know her by her Celtic name of Cerwyn, the owner of the cauldron that holds the lost knowledge and wisdom of the world. Is it any wonder then that she, at least from my point of view and probably Graham's, the face of Anglesey is one of the first we saw as children, and ultimately she has led us into this voyage of wisdom around the landscape of Albion. Graham only gave us a lower half definition of the inland Virgo, as Taurus overlapped her, but I have believed for some time that there should be another arm inland, and maybe it's embracing or leading our bull. And it wasn't until I did my update on my short reel and put colour to her that I noticed what I'd actually traced appeared to be the stump of an arm or the top of an arm that is now obscured by our bull's head. And as Mother Earth, she's associated with fertility, and as fertility is associated with the bull in many cultures, the bull being the male fertility and Mother Earth being the female fertility. So Taurus seems to be one of our most recognisable zodiac symbols, as it closely resembles the depiction from Ptolemy's zodiac, the Albion zodiac, and the head in the Glastonbury zodiac. And in Albion, this head is clearly defined by the River Conway. According to the Egyptians, our bull Avis is associated with Osiris, and Avis is often shown with a sun disk between its horns, and indeed we find the aptly named Dawn between the bull's horns, and coupled with Lake Bala at his hoof, we also can tie him back into the Sumerian bull god, Baal. In Arthurian legend, we also have Taurian, the wild brother of Sir Dodinal, the Wild, and there is even a breed of cattle known as King Arthur. And in Celtic culture, there's no real association with the bull and the creation story, but there is a very strong connection between the bull and fertility. In the modern zodiac, Gemini is known as the twin, but as with Pisces in the albion zodiac, we only have the singular, and in this case, it's an infant. This sleeping babe with its eyes awaiting to see forth and its mouth awaiting to speak, and more clues in the landscape, lays curled up on the lamb's fleece and almost curling up to the back end of our bull too. Is this King Arthur himself awaiting rebirth from his living pool, or the pool of life, Liverpool? Or am I over pushing the King Arthur links now? Certainly within the Celtic creation story, man is born or created from the bark of the strong and sturdy oak. So is this our newborn child waiting to make his first steps onto dry land from our strong and sturdy oak? So with Aries the lamb, with Leo the lion, Virgo our fertility, Mother Earth, goddess, Taurus and Gemini, we now have our land-based mammals of the zodiac, and they're all contained within the hull of our strong and sturdy oak arc. And as we move above the deck, moving on up, we come to our first winged beast. That of Ophiuchus, or should that be Griffin, Sphinx, or even Lamar or Lammas, whichever he's known by. He doesn't appear in our modern 12 symbols of the zodiac, although he has his modern name meaning serpent bearer, but here in Albion he is found in the geology itself, and he is a Griffin. And this can only mean one thing: the geology is not naturally formed, and we must consider it as either biogeology, being the theory that many of the rocks and stones formations around the world are petrified organisms or biological forms. Personally, in this case, I feel that it's more likely engineered rather than petrified fauna, mostly due to the overall size, but I am always open to the petrified argument, especially on objects of less than 1 kilometre in size. And I have to ask myself, if it appears in the Albion zodiac, might it also appear in the Glastonbury zodiac, but not identified yet? There seems enough space outside of Sagittarius and Scorpio, which is where he lies in the skies. But as Graham did, maybe Catherine Maltwood and even Mary Kane failed to recognise it, with their preconceptions of looking for Ptolemy's zodiac. Or maybe he was just included here to perform his duty of protecting Gemini from snakes. And it appears that the Griffin comes to our Grail story once again, being the final guardian before you achieve the Grail. Even the Celts have griffins, and they are associated with both the strengths of the lion and the eagle, as well as being protectors or guardians. Finally, on this section of the coastline at least, above our Griffin, we find a phoenix. Fortunately, the Glastonbury zodiac identified the phoenix as Aquarius. And at this point, I draw upon the wonderful Welsh interpretation of the word phoenix as provided by Hugh Evans on his Origins of the Zodiac channel, which I shared on my community pages of my Our Story channel. Hugh finds the literal meaning of the word phoenix is to rise up, but in Welsh this can also mean spring or well up, as in a natural water spring. So our association with rebirth from fire could potentially be rebirth from the water. Is this what our landscape is? The rebirth of the land after the rising of the waters. But how wonderful it is that our phoenix is known as the Lake District. The tongues of fire have been extinguished with pools of water. I feel our phoenix is female, as surely any association with birth should be associated with a female, and so we might even want to call our phoenix the Lady of the Lakes, and all legendary associations are acknowledged and accepted with our geological repository of stories. It is said that King Arthur fought his last battle at Camlan. Many Arthurian scholars claim this cannot be the same Camlan, which is just a sword's throw away from these lakes. And I remind you, the Glastonbury zodiac was only discovered because of the landscape's association with the Holy Grail story that was being illustrated by Catherine Maltwood, and the Holy Grail romances are entangled with the Arthurian legend. So on the head of our inverted phoenix we find a barrow on top of the fiery furnace of our phoenix's own wings that form a perfect pyre. So, is Barrow in Furnace the final resting place of King Arthur? It would seem a handy spot to cast his sword back to the Lady of the Lakes and lay in waiting for his rebirth at a time of Albion's greatest need. Although the Grail stories tell us that Morgan Le Fay came and took King Arthur's body away in the boat to the island of Avalon. What islands are close to Barrow in Furnace? Well, we haven't looked at it, but it's right in the middle there. Right in the middle of our zodiac, we have got the Isle of Man. But we'll look at that another time. The Celtic phoenix is said to be the only living creature allowed to fly to paradise. It is associated with the sun and lived for 500 to 1,000 years. It seems that every ancient culture has a phoenix in their myths. And there's an uncanny resemblance between the Celtic symbol and that of the Mockingjay in the Hunger Games film. As I said, my approach to the Albion landscape was slightly different to that of Graham's. And just before I crossed the Irish Sea, the observant among you may have realised that I've skipped over our dove of peace, our white isle, our symbol of hope, and one of our glories of the Albion, Libra. Libra is unique in the Albion zodiac, being entirely defined by its coastline. And as I said in my previous video, the scales of Ptolemy definition seem out of place with most of the traits of Librans, but maybe they needed to bring in the scales of justice, which seem to be, like the governments of the world these days, fixed in favour of the house rather than fair or in favour of the people. In Celtic mythology, the dove is associated with love and peace, as in many other cultures, but also as the keeper or purveyor of wisdom. The dove is also associated with Morrigan and often becomes her winged chariot, but Morrigan is also known as Morgan le Fay and ties us back to Arthurian legend. But the dove also has its own direct association with the Holy Grail, as it's often sighted before the arrival of the Holy Grail. It is also said that the White Isle is where Mary, with Joseph of Arimathea, landed prior to landing on the mainland when they brought the Holy Grail with them. At the end of 2022, when I first started looking at the possibility of the landscape of England being man-made, it seemed most people looking at Ireland saw a koala, despite koalas not being natural inhabitants outside of Australia. Personally, I saw a rotated small dog, like a Scotch Terrier. But after being introduced to Graham's book, I realised I needed heavenly intervention and inspiration with my thinking. Graham had missed out most of Ireland within the pages of his book, but I'm sure he knew there was something lurking in the landscape. Ireland was just too big to ignore. Graham clearly saw Scorpio covering most of Northern Ireland, and for me that didn't sit right. I am leaving Graham's interpretation and drawing of the scorpion as he defined it and drew it, as he did an amazing job. I also discovered it's not very easy trying to draw a curled up scorpion. I did want to move him slightly, but the online maps of Ireland are not as detailed as they are for England, which was going to be a bit of a problem for me later on. However, having looked again, I think he has found its perfect location. After correcting Graham's identification of Gemini's twin to Ophiuchus, the heavenly glory started to shine. It wasn't long before I realised that a possible missing constellation was that of Cetus. I believe now, for some reason I am not aware of yet, Ophiuchus and Cetus have been adopted by some astrology schools, and some horoscopes now include readings for them. After a brief search, I found my starting point, but I was slightly disappointed with the fishy tail that had been drawn. Further investigation, though, into Greek mythology gave me what I was looking for. Cetus is clearly described as having two rear limbs and a snout similar to a pig, so at least the head seemed appropriate. I managed to find a map with enough detail and found the River Shannon gave me the perfect definition to split the land into the two rear limbs. Honestly, I can't believe how hard it was to find a map of Ireland that showed rivers. The north coast clearly gave me a mouth, a snout and an eye. Following the detail within the landscape and on the maps gave me sight of his head, panning round to the east of Lough Neagh, through Antrim, south of Lurgan and Portadown, and round to Armagh. The line then split, part continuing to form the rest of the head, and the split going off towards the coast at Dundalk, which matched the line of Graham's scorpion. I was both amazed and disappointed with my find, amazed that I had found the largest 14th constellation, and disappointed that it had been so easy and covered the entire remaining landmass or coastline of Ireland. Graham's swirls of cloud seemed to be a smokescreen to cover what he had seen. I don't know if he saw anything else, but there are a couple of other swirls of smoky cloud towards the Scottish border. Cetus didn't fit into Graham's search for the 12 Glastonbury zodiac symbols within the English countryside, nor do I feel he could have included it in his 2003 presentation of Jerusalem. But within my remit of searching for clues and to identify the design of a possible man-made or engineered landscape, both Cetus and Ophiuchus are acceptable and in keeping with the overall design of the rest of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. In fact, they only strengthen my argument and provide undeniable evidence for my case. The fact that every inch of the coastline is accounted for and every one of the 14 constellations of the ecliptic touch, form and define that coastline means that pareidolia can be totally discounted and ignored. Those that say otherwise are not prepared to accept the evidence that is clear as day to me, and not prepared to admit they might have been lied to by their education system. With these constellations of the ecliptic now identified, this will not stop me looking for further constellations or other stories, myths, legends and fables written within the fabric of the landscape. Food for thought. Bear with me with this, as the route is wrong, but the result is good. The Australians and other nations refer to the English as pommies. Allegedly, it's a shortened version of pomegranate, and allegedly the egranate becomes rhyming slang for immigrant, as China is slang for mate from China plate, where the plate is the rhyming slang with the mate. But I don't buy that, buddy. It is interesting that if this was correct, then the occupants of the English penal colony, so immigrants from England, should refer to the motherland inhabitants as immigrants. Seems very strange. So really, if the pomegranate thing is correct, it's the Australians who are the Poms, not the English. But our history would also suggest that Albion is full of continental immigrants with several successive invasions, such as the Romans, the Angles, the Saxons, amongst others. And then there's the literal translation of the word Wales, which means foreigners. So did the Celts come to Albion after losing their homeland to floodwater, or having been exiled from somewhere else and took refuge on the raised land of the giants who offered them protection? And is Albion full of pommies? Now in French, a pomme is an apple and a pomme de terre is an apple of the earth or a potato. Now the Irish are associated with potatoes and allegedly staple crop until 1845 to 1852, very interesting dates by the way, when there was potato blight hit the land. The English as well are obsessed with potatoes with every meal, especially when you think of traditional dishes such as fish and chips, steak and chips, cottage pie, shepherd's pie, fish pie, bangers and mash, liver and mash, baked potato with a filling of your choice. So, as well as chips, mash and baked potatoes, we enjoy new potatoes, roast potatoes, rosties, which is fried grated potato, fried potato skins, potato wedges, hash browns, and many more serving suggestions, as well as potato-based snacks. Apples too are traditional fare, and we have applesauce with our roast dinner, apple pie after our roast dinner, apple crumble, apple turnovers, toffee apples, apple scones, even the Cornish pasty, which were once the traditional savoury at one end and sweet at the other, where apples could have been utilised, and potatoes in the other end as well. Then there's the drinks. Pressed apples and the brewing of apple cider has been a tradition probably for thousands of years. It is suggested in our history that both potatoes and apples are immigrants to the British Isles too. Potatoes coming from Virginia in 1586 and apples from Kazakhstan, allegedly with the Romans. Prior to the Romans, it's said that we only had crab apples. So it would appear that the climate of Albion seems to be good for growing of apples and potatoes, or should that be the perfect location for growing poms? So if British Isles is a great place for these poms, both underground and overground, we might like to call them the Isles of Poms, or Islands of Apples, which is the literal translation of Avalon, the land of apples, and said to be an island. And I asked, is Albion a corruption of Avalon, or vice versa? I'm told that the word Albion is older than Avalon, but as we keep seeing, the written history seems to have been removed, and we can't necessarily trust any documented timelines. And having said all that, and then returning to the Australians, they seem to be the ones who are the immigrants of their own country. However, further looking found Pom, P-O-M, may have been a prisoner of Millbank, which apparently is the name of the prison where the exported prisoners were held before transportation to Australia. And then there is the clothes that they were given once they arrived in Australia, and these were stamped with P-O-H-M, being the property of Her Majesty, or prisoner of Her Majesty. But whichever way you look at it, it seems that the Australians are wrong in calling us the Poms, unless you refer to the Oxford English Dictionary, where Pom, P-O-M-E, is the prisoner of Mother England, unless you were lucky enough to get to Australia where you became a prisoner of Her Majesty. But it would appear that every citizen of the world is the prisoner of their mother state. Now, if you are interned in England, you are a prisoner in Her Majesty's prison, which is now, I suppose, His Majesty's prison, and you have been convicted by His Majesty's court system, and you are held at His Majesty's pleasure. However, don't think you are free just because you're not in a cage. You are a slave to His Majesty's revenue and customs, which is controlled by His Majesty's Parliament, and live on the land that is registered at His Majesty's land registry offices. Of course, all the land was stolen. We can go back to 1066 and the invasion of William from Brittany, and he then created the Domesday Book, which was an inventory of all the land that he had just acquired. And then this is updated now every 10 years with other details taken in the census. And of course, like the rest of the world, we are prisoners to the state because we're enslaved in the central banking system, which is the printing of money on behalf of His Majesty's government, and forced into a debt-based economy based on a fiat currency, which is a promissory note and holds no value. That's right, your cash is actually worthless. And if you deposit it in the bank, it then belongs to the bank. And it still actually all belongs to the central bank because it's their money because they printed it. I think I'll stick with the apples and the potatoes explanation. It's far easier. Now, in my writing, I keep coming back to this Edinburgh and Edinburgh, and if Albion being full of apple trees and potatoes, as well as obviously by design, is this then the Garden of Eden? In the Christian biblical creation story of Genesis, God creates the Garden of Eden with a tree of life and a tree of knowledge, both good and evil knowledge, in the garden. As we've seen, our tree of life is now our arc of life and Cancer in the Albion Zodiac. In the Glastonbury Zodiac, the arc has a single passenger. The infant Gemini is now puts me in mind of Michelangelo's creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel. So, is Gemini our Adam, our living pool of life awaiting the spark from the cerebral god of knowledge to awaken him from his slumber? God's depiction in the Sistine Chapel has him sat on a cloud that has a striking resemblance to a brain. And since I mentioned the Isle of Man earlier, I wanted to point out the similarity of the shape of that island and that cloud. And if we took Genesis in the Bible literally, and God sat here in the middle of the Irish Sea on the Isle of Man, we might see that the Isle of Man is like Mount Olympus rising from the bed of the Irish Sea, and if the sea level was lower, it would realistically be a mountain, and the whole of the British Isles would be raised up and would be almost like a walled garden. So the Bible says that Eden was built to the east, and England is east of the Isle of Man, as is most of Europe. In the Sistine Chapel depiction, Adam has been likened to sitting in a heart-shaped cloud. So is our Gemini waiting for that spark to be brought to life, to get the blood flowing out of the living pool? And just a quick skip back to Ireland, was Arthur's trip to the underworld in his glass boat a trip to Ireland? Not only do we have a scorpion that is associated with the underworld, but we are on Cetus, known as the Kraken, who was summoned from the depths by Poseidon to take the life of Cassiopeia's daughter Andromeda, but saved by Perseus with the head of Medusa. So I suppose technically Cetus is associated with death too. Now in Greek mythology, they do say that Cetus was also known as the Kraken, and this is where I keep getting the reference from, the Kraken, Cetus. But interestingly, the Kraken is associated with the North Atlantic, and it was said to appear between Norway and Iceland. So maybe he's on the way there, or it's is a bit of a drift, or maybe if we view this from another perspective, he actually does appear between Norway and Iceland. And as Ireland is an island to the west of the British Isles and the Isle of Man, and west of most of Europe as well, it seems to be the perfect position to become the island of the underworld, as many cultures refer to it being an island in the west where the sun sets. And our Phoenix of the Lake District is facing Ireland, as if to set off in flight to his trip to the underworld where he was allowed to go. But is Ireland where Arthur went in search of Ceridwen's cauldron? He may well have seen many cauldrons, but found reaching them a little trickier, as they tend to appear at the end of the rainbow, and reaching the end of the rainbow generally is quite difficult to do. It's all to do with the bending of light and the light source being directly behind your head. So as you look at it, you look at the middle of a rainbow directly as you drew a line from the sun through your head to the centre of the ring. So you only see the top half, because usually the bottom half is covered in the land. And so the pot being at the end of the rainbow is just simply where it disappears into the land, and you can never reach it or touch it because it's always too far away. That's the technicality for you. So do our leprechauns actually hold their gold in cauldrons rather than pots? And just a quick reminder that Ireland is associated with the harp. It goes back a long way in their traditions and in their symbolism, and associated with one of their old kings, and I can't remember off the top of my head who that is. But also the harp, as I said, pointed out, seems to be associated with Cetus. So there seems to be this strange coincidence, again, another coincidence. But then thinking about if Ireland is then the underworld, there's an association with the harp and angels, and also with Greek gods, and as well as the Irish and the Guinness and well, the Irish. They were actually banned in England at one point as well, or banned in Ireland by the English. Strange little stories going on there. And just going back on the corruption of words, is Celt a corruption of Cetus? Is it just mispronunciation? Am I pronouncing Cetus wrong? Should I pronounce it Catus? But anyway, so is there a corruption there, or has the name changed? Ptolemy or his previous constellation Collator changed the name of Celtus to Cetus. Who knows? And then there is Cetus is sometimes called the whale, which might explain the depiction when I found the old depiction of the symbols and the graphical representation of Cetus having a fishy tail, as opposed to having the limbs of the Kraken. Again, maybe this was Ptolemy or previous people changing the imagery to remove the history. And then there's the Welsh, which is it a literal? Is Wales literally belonging to the whale, Cetus? Is Wales part of Ireland? Are the Irish, the foreigners, invaded or occupying Wales? And then there's Graham's reference to Jonah, putting Jonah in our Picean Peninsula, but maybe Wales is the better location because then Jonah is in the whale. But of course he didn't include Cetus or the whale, so he had to use Pisces. And maybe our pomme de terre, or apple of the land, is this the land where the poms grow in the ground, and Ireland becomes Avalon, literally the land of apples, not the orchard of apples or the tree of apples, but the land of apples. And of course, there is reason behind this madness where I start talking poms and pomme de terre. We have to remember that Grail's stories have a French connection, as it seems that they were revitalised or rewritten from older scripts, allegedly, in France and became the Grail romances some 1,000 years ago. And as Dan Brown did, we have to recognise that some of the story may have been lost in translation or corrupted in a foreign language. We remember his Holy Grail comes to the Holy Bloodline rather than the Holy Cup. So, moving on, and as I go to look at the landscape of Scotland, I may even have to redraw the graphical representations of other astronomical constellations, and if I do feel the need for this, I will be turning to Hugh Evans' work and knowledge. Hugh's work on the origins of the zodiac and his discovery of a star map within Gwynedd, North Wales, which I have said before sits in the armpit of Virgo, seems to be dated to around the same time as the coastline of the Albion Zodiac and the orientation of Aries, so it may offer up some clues in my search. Approaching subjects from an entirely new angle can often give great new insight into a subject, and until I contacted Hugh, I don't think he had considered that the landscape that made up the Gwynedd star map could have been man-made, or at least not as much as I have suggested it is. After all, it is one thing to make a mountain out of a molehill, but then to suggest that every hill and even the rivers that define the line of the ecliptic within the Welsh star map are by design too, might have once seemed an impossible concept to accept. And on the subject of water, I mentioned in my previous video that the Glastonbury zodiac was once a watery, stargazy eye of the giant Pisese peninsula that effectively reflected the heavens above, and I mentioned that this wasn't the only place where we found water exactly where it needed to be to bring the Albion zodiac stories to life. For those of you who have enjoyed my Tour of Albion videos, you may recall in video 4 on our return from the Scotland NC 500 that I stopped off in Cumbria on a cold and windy March morning to climb up to Hike-up Nick, which falls upon our crucified 48-mile tall representation of, well, let's call him Christ for the moment, although all the dates are probably 8 millennia adrift, as per my dating in video 2 of this series. But the landscape once again fits the story. Or does the story mimic our biblical repository? So much so that we have to bring into question the knowledge and authenticity of the New Testament, and in particular the crucifixion, which now indeed looks as if it is the fiction of the cross. So, our 10,000-year-old landscape is the living sculpture of events that apparently only happened 2,000 years ago. And I can understand why Graham's struggled with these facts, although his explanation for the Albion zodiac's existence seemingly becomes its own fairy tale, as he dates the landscape as being present day. That is to say, that with our education system teaching us of coastal erosion and other geological changes over time, Graham's natural conclusion is that the design of the landscape has never looked like this before and will never look like this again, as it is constantly changing. My view is demonstrated by this simple question: when did we last have to significantly redraw the coastline on our maps? And just while I'm on the subject of coastal erosion, critics of the Albion zodiac have asked me why, if it is man-made, does the snake head of Holyhead not have a smooth defined form, to which I say its form is not meant to be viewed and recognised close up, and would be like zooming into a digital photograph of a circle. And let's see what you look like after 10,000 years of being open to the elements. And on those grounds, I say the Albion zodiac is an amazing testament to its manufacture. So, back to Hike-up Nick. As Graham states, it is the exact spot that we are told Jesus was wounded by a spear whilst on the cross. Graham's interpretation of the name is that it's the point that a high cup or a holy grail might have been held up to a nick or wound to catch the blood of the Christ, and starts the whole Holy Grail saga. But Hike-up Nick itself sits at the point of a spearhead-shaped ravine or deep, short valley. At the very point of this valley is a wet, marshy area called Hike-up Plain, where water seems to spring from the earth itself as if it is bleeding in sympathy for the wounded Christ, or actually bringing the story to life. So, if we drink the water from High Cup Gill, would we be partaking in drinking the blood of Christ, or at least the landscape Christ, like the pagan rituals carried out in many churches worldwide every Sunday morning, when we might be offered the Holy Communion? Obviously, I'm not suggesting that we eat the soil too to partake in the eating of his flesh, but should we eat vegetables or fruit from grown in this area, or even mutton grazed on the grass, would we in some way be eating his flesh? The water at High Cup Nick flows west to the River Eden, which defines most of the right or west side of our 48-mile-long body, flowing past Temple Sowerby, which is associated with the Knights Templar, heading north past Carlisle and out into the Irish Sea, just north of our upturned Phoenix. A few miles northwest of High Cup Nick, water is used again to form the tear-soaked eye of our Christ figure in Rotherby Water near Hunsonby, which was covered in video 6 of my Albion tour of the Zodiac series. Having driven around the face, it felt like this watery eye had been scraped out of the surrounding land, as it was not visible from the road that ran alongside its flowing course. Now, the skeptic might say that the water had carved its channel in the land, but it just didn't feel like that whilst I took in the calming atmosphere at the water's edge. In Graham's final 2 chapters, he reveals a second figure on the cross with a complementary wound to High Cup Nick. This wound also bleeds through the cauldron's snout just below Cow Green Reservoir, which will feature in an up-and-coming tour video, and I even remembered to press the record button when I sent the drone up. Cow Green Reservoir and Cauldron Snout have been linked to the Holy Grail stories by other authors, with some believing that the cauldron or a bowl is the Holy Grail rather than a cup. The water from Cow Green Reservoir, after passing through the Cauldron Snout, meets some of the runoff from High Cup Plain and flows on to become the River Tees, which also goes on to define the head of Aries, the Lamb of God, as it flows to the North Sea. So, if one of the crucified figures is the yin and one the yang, then which is which? For in this topsy-turvy world, where Christians perform pagan rituals and ceremonies, one has to ask, are we kneeling in front of Christ or his dark twin? And did Graham identify him incorrectly, or rather correctly as the one that the Catholic Church presents to us, but just not the one we think it is? Should we be drinking the water from the Cauldron Snout rather than from High Cup Gill? Well, my take on it all is that we cannot know good without knowing evil, and vice versa. So really, we should be slightly lower downstream to take our water to a point where the good and the evil are combined. We need to accept both the good and the evil into our lives to know them both and to choose our path accordingly. The trick will be then to be able to identify the yin from the yang. As we move downstream from Cauldron Snout, we find a higher power, or to be more accurate, we find high force waterfall, where the mixed blood of the landscapes passes a narrow gorge. And had I known I was going to write this or come to this conclusion, then I might have stopped here to take some footage. Maybe next time I'm passing. But for now, I believe there is a lot more to see and find, and the most obvious place to continue my search is within the coastline of Scotland. So where the waters from High Cupnick meet the Irish Sea and the North Sea mark our current most northerly points on the coastline of England, which defines our 14 albion zodiac symbols when we include Ireland and Wales. Whilst I look at the coastline of Scotland, and even in these enlightened times, I will distract myself from the obvious phallus of Mull of Kintyre until I am left with a void in my coastline, or something jumps out at me that includes it. Or maybe it is the head of a snake, that snake that the Griffins trying to protect the infant from. I still firmly believe that the knowledge and understanding of this landscape will ultimately set us free from the plague of tyranny that has spread across the world and infiltrated every aspect of our life. With our 2020 vision, and as the smoky clouds disperse, we will slowly see that everything is connected, and some of these connections are good, some evil. But without knowing both, we cannot identify them as either. In Graham's final chapter, he shows us that the two figures become one. So the good mixes with the evil, and together they reveal the Lord of the Dance, and Albion once more comes to life, as if William Blake knew him personally in his portrait of the Dance of Albion. Another quick look to the Pennine Peaks finds Cross Fell overlooking Temple Sowerby. Cross Fell is where Graham drew the lower edge of the horizontal bar of the cross meeting the eastern edge of the upright, which, as I said in video 2, gives us our mechanism of dating the design as it falls in alignment with the dawn of the winter solstice. Now, there are two interesting facts that I'm going to share with you about Cross Fell. The first is that on the peak of Cross Fell, there is a stone cross on the ground, but it isn't in alignment with anything that I can see at the moment. Maybe someone can help me, because it's not north, south, east, west, and it's not in alignment with the cross that Graham drew. And the second interesting fact is, well, just before I reveal that fact, let's just look again at our yin and yang figures, and once again how these two men seem to merge into a third man. Once again, I find myself marvelling at the intelligence of the design, or is that artistry of the artist? To be honest, as I look at this conjunction within the constellations, I just simply appreciate that this cannot be by coincidence or a random gathering of the elements, that in which we just happen to find these figures in some sort of mass hypnotic pareidolia trance, and for the two to form a third is, well, in terms of natural formation, I could say the odds are astronomical. So my thinking is, are we seeing all three men who were allegedly crucified on a Friday some 2,000 years ago depicted as all sharing a single cross? And looking at the position of the cross fell, is it not perfectly placed to be the heart of our third man? And taking the road travelling northeast from the right wet eye of Rotherby Water, the road goes on to form the dry left eye from Melmerby. And as we go further, we come to the crossing of over the Pennines from Cumbria to County Durham at Hart Side Pass, although they've spelt Hart differently, just a few miles north of Cross Fell. And the second interesting fact that I wanted to show you is the remarkable resemblance of cross-fell topography to the shape of a heart. Is this then our sacred heart? Is it the heart of Albion? So at the start of this series, I posed myself a few questions. When was the Albion Zodiac designed and modelled? Who designed it? What is its meaning? How can this knowledge help us on our individual or collective journey and be the antidote to tyranny? So the first question was answered in video 2, where I found the orientation of the Lamb of God and the cross implied this date to be around 10,000 years ago, at least, as the next possible alignment prior to that date would be 36,000 years ago, which I personally felt might be too far back, although if it can be proven, then I would gladly accept the backdated finding and be even more amazed at how our coastline has stood up to 36,000 years of weathering. As to its design, I would now say it was maybe the Druids, or a previous intelligent race whose identity has been erased by the removal of written history by successive victors. But we can clearly say this design draws upon at least 50,000 years of recorded astronomical observations. This then brings into question the Romans' written history, stating that the Druids had no written knowledge passed on, as it would be extremely hard to keep 50,000 years of accurate records and dated data without written records or knowledge, and simply rely upon verbal traditions and knowledge, whilst erecting accurate henges in perfect celestial alignments. And the whole pre-Roman unenlightened style history starts to crumble. Then there is the evidence of knowledge locked in the place names, paths, roadways, rivers, boundaries, and the landscape itself, all showing that the design was known about and respected by pre-Roman occupants of Albion. I have been deliberating the question of meaning since my first glimpse of Graham's work, and I have finally settled on the fact that it is a graphical representation of history and knowledge as passed from the Druids to the Celts, or from whoever to whomever, possibly even from prior civilizations and intelligence, utilising the knowledge and representations of the constellation, again showing knowledge and observation and history. But it's simply put, it is a graphical repository of what we might call myths, legends, fables, religious texts, and history. One final thought on the meaning before I answer the final question. We are told that King Arthur had a round table. Depending on whose version of the story you read, there are any number of seats around the table, from 12 to 150. And way back in video 2, I showed you that the zodiac was represented by a circle. The Arthurian legend is so woven into the fabric of the landscape of the Albion Zodiac that it would not surprise me to find another 10 Knights' Tales in the landscape of Scotland. Due to weather restrictions back in March, we didn't have time before the snow came to visit Fort George, just outside Inverness. It had already grabbed my attention as a star fort, and the stained glass window of the garrison chapel has St. George and a dragon's head depicted in it, often in old printed scripts. F's and S's are confused, so Fort, FT, George, may have originally been seen or may have even been called St. George, ST. And we pull back on the aerial view and we can indeed see that St. George or Fort George is a star fort in the shape of a dragon's head. Should we call him Sir Cerberus rather than St. George? I make these videos to change the way you think because almost everything you have been taught was designed to stop you from thinking critically and accept everything you are told as truth without question. I hope you have enjoyed this short series covering the 2003 publication Behold Jerusalem by Graham K. Griffiths, which is available in full on my Albion Landscape Zodiac playlist. The additional definition and documentation of the constellation of Cetus as defined by the coastline of Ireland was identified by myself in June 2023. I'd like to thank Hugh Evans for his contributions to this subject and additional source information taken from his publication, The Origin of Numbers and The Origin of the Zodiac. My next published video will probably see a return to the tour of the Albion, and I have at least 2 trips to document where I'll be visiting Gwynedd and looking at Hugh's StarMap landscape. Links to Hugh's videos and his website can be found within the description of this video and in my playlist of videos you might like, along with the occasional posting within the community page of this channel. Please like, share and subscribe to my channel and this video. And in answer to the final question as to why it is the antidote to tyranny and how does it help us on our journey, I ask you to ponder this. The truth is out there. Its knowledge will set us all free. And there you go.